Some stories don't begin with a bang. Some begin with a letter, delivered 20 years too late. In today's episode of Silent Valor Stories, we follow the final journey of Clarence Hayes, a man who thought the past was buried until it wrote him a letter. This is not a story about war. It's a story about guilt, silence, and the long road toward redemption. Through the sands of a desert and the weight of memory. If stories like this move you, challenge you, or make you feel a little less alone, consider subscribing. There's always another silent voice waiting to be heard. Asterisk. It was the kind of fall morning that made you believe just for a moment that the world was at peace. Leaves rustled gently on the sidewalk. The air was crisp, the kind that made you reach for an old flannel shirt, not because it was cold, but because it reminded you of something safe. The sky was clear, the kind of clear you only get in early October, before winter starts whispering through the cracks of old windows. Clarence Hayes stood in the doorway of his modest home on the edge of town, coffee in hand, slippers scraping against the wooden floor. His hair was a mix of white and gray, like smoke trailing off the edge of a campfire, and his eyes, once fierce, had faded into something quieter over the years. He was 64 now, still moved with a slight limp, a souvenir from the war he never talked about. Iraq, 2004, Al Anbar Province. A name he didn't need to say out loud to remember. He shuffled to his mailbox like he did every morning. Bills junk. The usual. But one envelope stood out. It was yellowed, worn, like it had spent years in a pocket or the bottom of a bag that had been dragged through the desert. No return address, no postmark. Just a single sentence on the front, written in shaky, smeared ink. If you're still alive, read this. Forgive me, if you can. Clarence froze. His heart didn't pound, it sank. His fingers trembled slightly, the way they did when the pain in his leg flared up. But this wasn't pain from the body. This was something deeper, older. He looked at the handwriting again. He knew it. God help him. He knew it. Boone Miller. Boone had been his best friend in the army. They'd met in basic. Ended up in the same unit. Served together on recon missions across the worst parts of Iraq. Watched each other's backs. Pulled each other out of fire. Laughed about opening a bar when they got home. Called it 2 idiots and a beer. Then, Boone was gone. Missing during a classified mission in 2004. Presumed dead. No body recovered. No ceremony. Just a folded flag sent to a sister back in Nebraska. Clarence had received nothing, no answers, no closure. He never asked for any, because some part of him didn't want them. Now, 20 years later, a letter. He didn't open it right away. Instead, he stood in the kitchen, the envelope resting like a bomb on the table. He poured himself another coffee. Forgot to drink it. Took the envelope. Turned it over. Back again. Sat down. Stood up. Paced. Came back. And finally peeled the flap open. Inside, a single sheet of paper. Creased so many times it felt like tissue in his hand. The ink had bled from water, sweat, or maybe tears. But the handwriting was unmistakable. Boone's. It wasn't long. Just a few lines. If you're reading this, then I didn't make it out. Not really. Maybe I lived a little longer. Maybe I didn't. I don't know how or when this letter will get to you. All I know is I couldn't leave without trying to tell the truth. I failed them, Clarence. That night in the rocks. I didn't do what I should have done. I ran. They died. You probably hate me now. You should. But if there's anything left in you, maybe take a look at the map I left. Maybe you'll understand. Maybe you'll forgive. If not, well, I had to try. There was more. A crude drawing, tucked in the envelope, a hand-sketched map, coordinates scribbled in the corner. A familiar stretch of desert marked with an X. Clarence sat back in his chair, not crying, not breathing, just still. 15 minutes passed, maybe more. Time doesn't move right when ghosts walk back into your life. Boone had run? That couldn't be true. Not Boone, not the guy who once stood between Clarence and a sniper's bullet, without flinching. Not the man who carried a wounded child 4 miles to safety in 120-degree heat. Boone had been brave, too brave, but the letter didn't lie. Or at least, Boone didn't think it did. Clarence rubbed his temples, the soft ache behind his eyes. Turning sharp. Guilt was a strange thing. Some days it was a whisper. Others a hurricane. And now, 20 years later, it showed up wearing Boone's handwriting. He pulled a faded duffel bag from the closet. The same one he'd brought back from Iraq. It still smelled faintly of sand, oil, and gunpowder. He tossed in a few clothes. An old map, a compass. Then paused. He took a slow breath and walked to the shelf in the hallway. A photo of his old unit sat there, 8 men in dusty uniforms, grinning like they just won the lottery. Boone was front and center, his arm slung over Clarence's shoulder. Clarence picked it up, stared at it. "This isn't just about you, is it?" he whispered. "It's about all of them." He didn't tell anyone he was leaving. Didn't call his daughter in Austin. Didn't email his VA counselor. This wasn't something you shared. This was something you finished. He booked a one-way flight to Amman, Jordan, using an old contact who still owed him a favor. From there, he'd make his way across the border. The route was risky, unofficial, and possibly illegal. But some things are worth the risk, especially when they've been waiting for 2 decades. On the flight, Clarence kept the letter in his shirt pocket, pressed against his chest like a second heartbeat. He reread it dozens of times, looking for something between the lines, a code, a message, anything. But Boone hadn't written it like a soldier. He'd written it like a man trying to die with a little less weight on his soul. As the plane landed, Clarence felt the ache in his leg grow worse. The desert had always had a way of waking old wounds. He gritted his teeth, pulled his cap low, and stepped off the plane. Hot wind greeted him like a slap, and just like that, it all came back. The smell of the air, the way the sun hit the sand, the sound of boots crunching under grit. He wasn't a tourist here. He was a man chasing ghosts. He met up with a contact from a small humanitarian organization. Told them he was looking for remains. Said he'd lost a friend in the war, and that after all these years, he just wanted to bury him right. No one questioned him. Most people in this part of the world understood loss better than questions. Gave him 2 guides, young, polite, with eyes that had seen too much. They loaded into a battered jeep, the map clutched tightly in Clarence's hand. As they drove deeper into the Al-Anbar region, the landscape began to blur between memory and present. Clarence didn't say much. He didn't need to. Every rock, formation, every patch of sand told him stories his heart remembered better than his mind. They stopped near an unmarked ridge. The place on Boone's map. Clarence stepped out. His knees ached. His breath was shallow, but he felt something shift in the air. As if the desert knew. Someone had come back. He turned slowly, taking it all in, then whispered into the wind. "Boone, are you really still out here?" Clarence Hayes never imagined he'd return to Iraq. The last time he was there, he left behind more than blood and broken bones. He left behind something harder to name, something buried so deep inside it didn't even ache most days. Just lingered. He'd made a silent promise the day he flew home on a stretcher in 2004. Never again. Not to the land, not to the war, not to the ghosts. But 20 years had a way of wearing down even the hardest promises. And all it took was one letter, one smudged envelope. One friend who should have been dead, and yet had somehow whispered. Back from beneath the sand, now Clarence sat in the back seat of a dust-covered Land Cruiser, rattling its way down forgotten roads through Al-Anbar province, the same province where the worst days of his life had once unfolded. The sky above was merciless, not a single cloud. The sun hung overhead like a punishment. Even through the tinted windows, the heat bled in. Next to him, on the cracked leather seat, lay a faded canvas folder. Inside, Boone's letter, the hand-drawn. Map, a printout of the coordinates, and a photograph. The photo was old, creased at the corners, worn like it had been touched too often. It showed Boone and Clarence during their deployment. Both grinning, arms slung around each other like brothers. Covered in dust, but smiling like they hadn't yet seen what was coming. Clarence hadn't smiled like that in a long time. In the front seats were two guides, local men in their early 30s, speaking to each other in Arabic between long stretches of silence. Yusef and Hamid. Clarence didn't know much about them, only that they worked with a non-profit that helped identify lost remains from various conflicts. They didn't ask too many questions, which suited him just fine. Yusef had asked once, back at the outpost, "He was your brother?" Clarence had looked up from the map and said softly, "He was the closest thing I had to one." The road turned to sand. Then the sand turned to stone. And then it wasn't a road anymore, just the memory of one. Swallowed by time and heat. Clarence leaned his head against the window, watching the desert unfold like an old scar. Every rock formation, every dip in the land, it all clawed at. Something in his memory, the smell of gunpowder, the weight of armor on his shoulders, the sound of Boone's laugh during downtime, the deafening silence after Boone went missing. It all came back too easily. The car jolted suddenly, shaking him from the haze. "We are close," Hamid said from the front, pointing at the GPS. "Maybe 10 kilometers more." Clarence nodded. His voice didn't come. Just a lump in his throat that hadn't left since the letter arrived. He opened the canvas folder and unfolded Boone's map again. The drawings were simple but precise. A hill shaped like a crooked finger, a dry riverbed, a strange formation that looked like a sleeping lion. Boone had always been good at drawing weird metaphors into his maps. Clarence smiled weakly. Some things didn't change, even in death. He touched the spot Boone had marked with an X. "I'm coming," he whispered. 15 minutes later, they stopped near a ridge where the sand met rock. Clarence stepped out first. The heat slammed into him like a wall. It wasn't just the temperature, it was the weight of it. The desert had a way of pressing down on you, like it remembered who you were and didn't quite forgive you. He pulled his hat low and looked around. Just sand, stone, sun. But then he saw it. The ridge ahead twisted sharply, like a finger pointing towards something ancient. Next to it, a dip in the land, dry, narrow, almost like a forgotten trench. And just beyond that, a dark line of rock that looked almost deliberate. Like a path someone had walked so many times. The earth decided to remember it. Boone's map had drawn all of it. He took a shaky breath. This is the place. Yusef and Hamid began unloading small equipment from the back. Shovels, ropes, ground-penetrating scanner, old but reliable. Clarence waved a hand. "No need," he said. "I don't want machines. If he's here, I'll find him myself." They exchanged a glance, but didn't argue. Clarence moved slowly, following the lines of Boone's drawing step by step. Every few feet, he stopped and scanned the land with his eyes. It had been 20 years, but some instinct still lived inside. Him, the same one that had once helped him spot tripwires in the sand and shapes in the shadows. Then he saw something odd, just past a jagged rock. barely visible beneath a thin layer of dust, a pattern unnatural, rectangular, faint. He dropped to one knee, brushed the sand aside with his hand. His fingers trembled. It was the edge of a flat stone slab, unnaturally smooth, possibly placed. His heart raced. He called the others over. Yusef knelt beside him. "This looks like a cover," he said. Together, they began digging. Not deep, just careful. The sand was dry and thin, rushing away like powder. After 20 minutes, they uncovered what looked like the entrance to a small chamber cut directly into the rock. Clarence stared at it. His chest tightened. Boone hadn't run. Boone had hid. "I want to go in alone," Clarence said. Yusef hesitated. "It may not be safe." "I've done worse," Clarence replied, already gripping the edge. He lowered himself slowly into the opening. It wasn't a cave, not exactly. More like a hollowed-out chamber, big enough for one man to lie in, maybe two to crouch. The air was stale, dry as bone. His flashlight flickered across the space. That's when he saw it. A body, curled against the stone wall, almost fetal. Dressed in what remained of a U.S. Army uniform, sun-bleached, worn thin. One arm wrapped around an old M4 rifle. The other clutched something to the chest. Clarence's breath caught. Boone. He didn't need DNA. He didn't need a dog tag. He knew. His knees gave way, and he sat heavily on the stone floor. For a long moment, he didn't move, didn't speak, just stared. The skeleton was intact, peaceful, like Boone had simply gone to sleep one night and never woke up. In the dead man's arms was a weathered notebook. Clarence reached out, hands trembling, and gently pulled it free. He didn't open it yet. Instead, he looked at his old friend. A man he'd once joked about growing old with. A man who used to steal extra MRE cookies and stash them for birthdays. A man who had disappeared without goodbye, now finally found in silence. The walls of the chamber didn't echo. But Clarence whispered anyway. "You waited, huh? Damn you, Boone. You waited." Outside, the sun beat down. But inside that little chamber, it felt like the desert held its breath. Clarence ran his fingers along the cover of the notebook. Boone had written one letter, but he'd left behind more. And Clarence was ready to read it all. The stone chamber was no bigger than a closet. The kind of space that would make a man go mad if he had to sit in it long enough. But Clarence Hayes didn't feel claustrophobic as he knelt beside the remains of his best friend. What he felt was something heavier than fear, heavier than grief. He felt the weight of unfinished business. Boone Miller had been declared KIA in 2004. No body. No last words. Just a line in a report. Presumed lost during classified recon operation. No remains recovered. Clarence had never believed it. He wanted to, but deep down he knew Boone wouldn't just vanish. And now, here he was left of him. The bones were neatly arranged, undisturbed by time. His arm was still wrapped protectively around the rusted-out remains of his service rifle, an M4 with the barrel pointed toward the far wall, like he'd fallen asleep on watch. His fingers, what remained of them, clutched a small weathered notebook, its cover cracked and flaking, the kind of material that had to survive against sweat, blood, and desert air. Clarence had seen notebooks like this during the war. They weren't issued. They were kept by men who needed to write when talking didn't work anymore. Clarence sat in the chamber for a long time. He didn't rush. The heat outside was relentless. But in here, it was cool, quiet, timeless. He didn't speak. There was no one to speak to. Just Boone and the silence they both carried. He finally opened the notebook. The first few pages were technical. Coordinates, call signs, squad logs. Clarence skimmed those. It was muscle memory data, shorthand, the stuff they used to jot down between briefings and firefights. But around page 15, Boone's handwriting changed. The letters weren't sharp anymore. They wavered, slanted, like a man writing with shaky hands, and a heavier heart. Clarence turned the page slowly, carefully, like he might tear the paper if he breathed too hard. It's been 3 days since I went into hiding. I think I lost them. Or maybe they just gave up. Either way, I'm not going back. There's nothing to go back to. Clarence paused. What the hell happened out here, Boone? He read on. We got ambushed at the ridge. 3 snipers. At least 1 mortar team. It happened fast. I froze. I don't remember aiming. I remember running. I remember the others yelling. Then it got quiet. Too quiet. Clarence remembered that night. Or at least the aftermath. They'd found remnants of gear, blood trails, no bodies. The official line was that Boone had been killed in the chaos. But this wasn't chaos. It was a confession. I circled back 6 hours later. I found them. What was left? God? Clarence, I didn't even recognize some of them. The sand was red. It wasn't supposed to go that way. We were the ghosts, the silent ones. We were supposed to be better. Clarence's throat clenched. His heart was pounding now, louder than the desert wind outside. I sat there all night. With them. Didn't move. Didn't blink. Just sat. I thought maybe a drone would see me. Maybe someone would come. But no one came. No one even noticed we were gone. Clarence could picture it now. Boone, sitting alone among the dead. The only survivor of their squad, unable to call for help, maybe unwilling. He could feel the sand beneath him, the hollow quiet of the desert swallowing everything whole. He turned the page. I've decided not to leave. This is where I should be. With them. If I go home, what do I say? That I ran? That I froze while they died? What kind of man does that? I thought I was brave. Turns out I'm just a coward with a map. Clarence wiped his eyes with the sleeve of his shirt. He didn't care if the others outside heard him crying. He wasn't ashamed. He read the last page slowly. If this ever reaches you, Clarence, it's because I couldn't leave you wondering. You deserve the truth. Not the headlines. Not the folded flag. Just the truth. I don't expect forgiveness. I just hope that somewhere in that tough old heart of yours, there's still a sliver of the guy who used to share a tent with me in the cold and talk about building a bar in Montana. Tell them I wasn't a hero. Tell them I made the wrong call, but also tell them I stayed. I didn't leave again. Boone hadn't been a coward. Clarence could see that now. Running had been instinct. Staying had been choice. Clarence closed the notebook and pressed it to his chest. The stone beneath him felt more sacred than any cathedral. He didn't want to move. But Boone deserved more. Than bones in a hole. He climbed out of the chamber, holding the notebook like it was made of glass. Yusef looked at him, eyebrows raised. You found him? Clarence nodded. I found him, he said, voice raw. And he stayed exactly where he said he would. They didn't ask for details, just waited. Clarence told them he wanted to a proper burial, a military one. They offered to help, and he accepted not because he couldn't do it alone, but because something in him said Boone had waited long enough. The 3 men worked through the afternoon. They cleared the entrance, gathered rocks, cleaned the space. Yusef made a marker out of a broken crate. Clarence used his pocket knife to carve Boone's name into the wood, but that didn't feel like enough. So, he added a second line. You stayed. You didn't run. Rest easy, brother. They wrapped what was left of Boone in an old army poncho, folding it with the same reverence as a flag. Clarence took out the American flag he'd brought from home, one folded tight in a triangle since. His discharge. He pressed it into Boone's hands. Then he did something unexpected. He reached into his shirt and pulled out his own unit badge. A metal emblem, scratched and dented from years of war and time. He placed it gently into Boone's folded arms. "You earned it more than I ever did," Clarence whispered. As the sun began to set, they covered the grave with rocks, not to hide it, but to protect it. A grave without honor is just a hole. Boone deserved more. When it was done, Clarence stood in silence. The air was cooler now. The desert was golden, shadows stretching across the sand like reaching arms. He knelt beside the grave and whispered, "I spent 20 years wondering what happened to you. And now I wish I didn't know. But thank you for telling me, for trusting." He placed the notebook back into the stone chamber, beneath Boone's resting place. Not as a secret, but as a monument. The kind that wouldn't fade in wind or sand. And then he did something he hadn't done in a very, very long time. He saluted, not to the flag, but to the man. The sun dipped behind the ridge. And somewhere between the wind and the quiet, Clarence felt something leave him. Some ache, some burden. It didn't vanish, but it shifted, became lighter, because the truth had a way of doing that. Even after 20 years. The desert grave stood silent. Boone Miller now rested beneath a carefully arranged pile of stones, wrapped in an army poncho, holding the folded flag of a nation that never got to say goodbye. Clarence Hayes stood over it, hands in his pockets, his breath shallow. The dry wind tugged at his jacket, blowing sand into the creases of his tired face. His knees ached from crouching. His back throbbed from the shoveling. But the real weight was somewhere deeper right behind his ribcage, where guilt and grief liked to nest. Yusef and Hamid, the two guides who had helped him through this journey, had backed away respectfully. They were sitting on the edge of a rock, drinking water, whispering to each other in Arabic, giving Clarence space. He appreciated that. He needed this moment to himself. Clarence lowered himself slowly, sitting cross-legged by the grave, his hands resting on his thighs. His gaze fell on the edges of the grave, where the sunlight caught in the gaps between the stones. Then, almost unconsciously, his hand moved to his chest, pulling out the small field notebook he'd taken from Boone's remains. He hadn't read all of it, not yet. He wasn't ready then. He wasn't sure he was ready now. But Boone had left it for someone. And Clarence was the only one who had come. He opened the notebook again. The paper crackled softly. The ink was faded in places, but Boone's handwriting, slanted and worn still, held something personal, something alive. Clarence turned past the pages he'd already read, the confessions of the firefight, the fear, the moment of silence that followed the deaths of their squadmates. He reached the part he hadn't yet explored, and then he read, "Day 4. My water is low. Food's gone. No sign of movement on the ridge. I heard a helicopter yesterday, but it didn't come this way. I didn't call it. I didn't want to be found yet. It's strange. Out here in the silence, things feel clearer. There's no radio static, no screaming, no pressure. Just me and the truth. And the truth is, I don't know who I am anymore." Clarence exhaled slowly, his eyes stinging. He kept reading. "I want to believe I'm a good man. But good men don't freeze. Good men don't run when their brothers are pinned down. And I did. I ran like a scared dog. And then I came back too late. Clarence, if you're reading this, I know you. I know your silence. Your shoulders always carried more than your fair share. You never said a word when you were hurting. But I saw it. All of us did." That sentence stopped him cold. Clarence closed the notebook briefly and let out a bitter laugh, one of those dry, hollow sounds that's not really joy, just exhaustion finding a crack. Boone had seen him. Even back then. In the war, Clarence had been the rock. Always dependable, always composed. But inside, he'd been cracking for years. Nobody ever asked. And he never volunteered the truth. He opened the notebook again. I remember that. Night after Cruz got hit. You sat by the Humvee alone for hours, just staring at the sand. I walked over, asked you if you were okay, and you said, "I'm just thinking about gas mileage." But your eyes, man, they told the whole story. I should have told you then. Told you I was scared too, that I couldn't sleep, that I saw their faces every time I blinked. But I didn't. I let you carry it for both of us. Clarence swallowed hard. His hands trembled. He placed the notebook on his lap and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Tears came freely now. Not the hot, dramatic kind. These were quiet, slow-moving tears born not just of grief, but of release. I thought if I stayed here, maybe I could rewrite what happened. That maybe dying slowly in the same desert would somehow make up for freezing when it mattered. That maybe this ground would forgive me, or at least forget me. But the truth is, it doesn't. And I think neither will you. But I hope you'll understand. Clarence wiped his cheek. I do now, he whispered. I didn't write this for the history books. I didn't write it to be a hero. I just wrote it because I couldn't let my last thoughts be silence. I owed somebody my truth. And you're the only one who might still care enough to read it. Clarence paused. He looked out toward the horizon, where the sun was beginning to dip, casting long golden shadows over the sand. Everything in the desert felt endless, eternal. And yet, Boone had fit his last 20 years into this little cave, into these pages. What had Clarence done with his? Divorced, retired early, drank too much, isolated himself from his daughter, spent years pretending he didn't dream about Iraq, pretending he didn't hear gunfire in the distance when it was just the crack of branches. He'd survived, but he hadn't really lived. Boone's death, and now his truth, were finally teaching him what it meant to wake up. Clarence turned to the last entry in the book. It was dated just 2 days after the previous one. The writing was faded, some words smudged. I don't know what day it is anymore. My watch stopped. My head feels light. But there's peace now. I've said everything I could say. I hope someone finds this. I hope it matters. Clarence, if this is you, thank you. For being my brother. For carrying what I couldn't. For showing up, even when the world gave you every reason not to. You always said, we don't leave anyone behind. Well, you didn't. There were no goodbyes. No, tell my family I love them. Just the final flick of Boone's pen. Clarence closed the notebook and held it to his chest. For a while, he just breathed, letting Boone's words settle in his bones, letting the wind pass over him like a blanket, letting silence be enough. He stood up slowly and walked over to the grave. He knelt, cleared a patch of stone with his hand, and pulled something from his jacket pocket, a worn military coin. Boone had given it to him years ago, after their first successful mission. A coin for courage. Clarence had kept it in his wallet ever since. He placed it gently atop the stones. Then he whispered, "You were brave, Boone. You were human. You did what you could, and now you can rest." He stood up again, a little straighter this time, not because the grief was gone, but because the weight had been shared. That night, Clarence sat by a small fire outside the ridge with Yusef and Hamid. The sky above them was so wide and so black it felt like falling upward. The stars were endless. He didn't talk much, just drank tea and listened to the crackle of flames. But when Hamid finally asked, "Was he your best friend?" Clarence didn't hesitate. He looked up at the stars and said softly, "He still is." And when they asked what he planned to do next, he didn't know the answer. But one thing was certain. He wasn't going home with silence in his pocket. He was going home with truth, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The fire crackled quietly in the dark. Clarence Hayes sat cross-legged on a faded army blanket, a metal canteen resting at his side. The sky above him stretched endlessly, a black canvas freckled with stars that blinked like faraway memories. The desert around him had gone still. Even the wind had decided to rest dot behind him, nestled beneath a mound of carefully laid stones. Was Boone Miller his best friend, his brother in arms, now finally at peace dot, and in front of him was no one. Just open space and silence. But Clarence spoke anyway. "You know," he began, his voice gravelly, "I practiced what I'd say if I ever saw you again. For 20 years. Maybe 100 different speeches in my head. Some of them I was yelling. Some of them I was crying. But most of the time, I just didn't say anything at all." He looked up at the stars, squinting. "I think silence is something we got good at, huh? You didn't talk about what haunted you. I didn't talk about what broke me. Hell, we were trained not to. Just shut up, lace your boots, and keep moving." He reached for the canteen, took a long sip, and then shook his head. "But here's the thing, Boone. I kept moving. Yeah, but I never went anywhere." The fire popped softly, the embers glowing gold against the endless dark. Clarence looked at the ground. "You remember when we got back from that one mission south of Fallujah? That day we lost crews and barely got out with our skin? You and I sat on that rooftop for hours, and I didn't say a word. Just smoked a whole damn pack while you kept trying to make me laugh." He chuckled weakly. "You said we were gonna open a bar when we got home. 2 idiots and a beer. God, you were serious too. Had a whole plan. Montana, pool table, free beer for veterans." Clarence's smile faded. "I went home, Boone. You didn't. And I wish I could tell you. It got better. That I lived a good life. But I didn't. I existed. I did the motions. Got married, divorced. Had a job, lost it. Never made it back to Montana." He paused. "I think maybe a part of me stayed here, right in this damn desert." He glanced over his shoulder at Boone's resting place. "When I got the letter, I didn't even think it was real. I thought maybe someone was messing with me. But then I saw your handwriting, and brother, I swear to God, my heart stopped. Not because I was scared, but because I knew you weren't lost. You were just waiting for me to come get the truth." Clarence shifted, his knees stiff. "You weren't a coward, Boone. You weren't weak. You were just human. Same as the rest of us. We all froze at some point. We all made calls we weren't proud of. But you stayed. That means something." He let out a slow breath, rubbing the back of his neck. "I used to think surviving was enough. That if I made it home in one piece, I had somehow earned the right to forget everything. But I didn't forget. Not once. I carried it. I carried you. All of you. And I didn't even realize how heavy it was. Until I let it out down there. In that cave." Clarence grew quiet, eyes fixed on the flames. Then he spoke again, softer now. "You want to know something real messed up? I used to be angry at you. Not just for dying, but for not dying like a hero. Isn't that twisted? I wanted you to be shot charging into fire, not hiding in a hole. I needed that story to make peace with your ghost." He swallowed hard. "But now, I get it. I finally get it. You stayed with the truth. You didn't go back and lie. You didn't rewrite the ending. You just laid down next to it." Clarence reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the now familiar field notebook. He placed it gently on the blanket beside him, running a calloused finger along the cover. This little book, it's heavier than a rifle. Not because of what it weighs, but because of what's inside. You didn't write excuses. You didn't ask for redemption. You just told the truth. And brother, that's more courage than I've ever seen from any general." He leaned back, sighing deeply. "You know what's funny? I used to think you were the lucky one, that you got to die before the guilt set in. But now, I think maybe I was the lucky one." He looked up again, eyes reflecting the stars. "Because I got to come back and finish what you started." He went silent for a long moment. The desert around him stayed quiet, respectful, almost reverent. Then Clarence chuckled. "You'd hate all this poetic crap, wouldn't you? You always said I got soft when I talked too much. You'd be sitting here rolling your eyes, cracking open a warm can of beer, talking about how you just needed a damn cheeseburger and a shower." His smile widened, a real one this time. "God, I missed your dumb jokes." The fire crackled, little louder, and the wind returned, just a breeze, brushing sand across the blanket, as if the desert itself had been listening and finally decided to exhale. Clarence grew quiet again. He reached over and gently picked up the notebook, then pressed it against his chest. "You saved me, Boone, not just back then in the war, but now. You gave me something I didn't even know I needed. A reason to stop being numb. A reason to write back." He turned toward the grave once more. "I'm going to tell the others' families. Not the part about you running. Not to protect you, but because that's not the story that matters. What matters is that someone came back to speak for the dead. Someone stayed with the truth." He reached into his other pocket and pulled out a small metal dog tag. His own. He held it in his palm for a moment, feeling the weight of years etched into every scratch. Then he stood up, walked over to Boone's grave, knelt, and tucked it into a gap between two stones. "You don't have to carry it alone anymore," he said. And with that, Clarence stepped back. The sky above had shifted, stars drifting, the moon climbing higher. The kind of night you don't forget, no matter how many more follow. He folded the blanket, packed up his canteen, and stood in the middle of the desert, staring at the grave. One last time. "Good night, Boone," he said quietly, and then, without looking back again, he walked toward the horizon, where the faintest hint of morning was beginning to bloom. The sun was rising over Al Anbar when Clarence Hayes said his final goodbye. The desert stretched wide and golden, silent as a cathedral. Boone's grave, marked with a small pile of hand-picked stones and a piece of driftwood carved with his name, sat just beyond the edge of a forgotten ridge. There was no ceremony, no trumpet playing, no folding of flags by gloved hands. But Clarence didn't need all that, because he knew what had been done here was real. And Boone could finally rest. Clarence stood at attention for a long moment, one hand to his brow in salute. He didn't rush it. He didn't move until the wind shifted and brushed past his shoulder like a hand saying, "It's okay. Go now." He turned, slowly picked up his canvas bag, and walked away without looking back, not because he wanted to forget, but because he had finally remembered enough. The trip back to Amman was quiet. Clarence barely spoke on the long ride across the desert. Yusef and Hamid respected the silence, as they had respected everything else since the first day they met him. They dropped him off near a small transit point, gave him a bottle of water, and placed a hand over their hearts in parting. "Peace to your friend," Hamid said simply. Clarence nodded. "Peace to all of them," he replied. At the airport, people moved around him like dust in the wind. Tourists, aid workers, business travelers. All of them lost in their own destinations, their own problems. Nobody noticed the older man with the sunburned neck, faded boots, and weathered canvas duffel slung over one shoulder. And that was fine. Clarence didn't want attention. What he wanted was to bring the truth home. Back in the States, autumn had arrived again. The air was crisp, cool, and a little damp, Like the season couldn't decide if it wanted to be beautiful or sad. Clarence walked down the street toward his small house, a worn flannel shirt wrapped tightly around his shoulders. His gait was slow, not from the limp. He'd had that for years, but from something deeper. A kind of caution, as if the world might not be the same after everything he had seen. Or maybe he wasn't the same anymore. He stepped up to his porch, unlocked the door, and entered. It was just how he'd left it. Clean but quiet. Photos on the wall. His old service medals in a shadow box he never talked about. A dusty copy of Mice and Men still resting on the side table. No one had been here since he left, and yet something about the place felt lighter now. Clarence dropped his bag at the door and walked over to the kitchen counter, where a stack of unopened mail waited. He sifted through it idly. Bills, a coupon flyer, a card from his daughter in Austin. He smiled at the envelope, placed it aside, and poured himself a cup of coffee. The mug was chipped. The kind Boone used to joke about. You got $1,000 worth of gear and still drink from a mug older than your boots. Clarence took a sip and walked to his old writing desk. There, he placed the field notebook gently down. He stared at it for a long while, then pulled open a drawer and took out a blank notepad. His handwriting was slower now, more deliberate, but his words were firm. To the families of those lost on September 3rd, 2004. Al Anbar Province, you don't know me. Or maybe you've forgotten. My name is Clarence Hayes. I served with your sons and daughters in Echo Recon, 3rd Battalion. For the last 2 decades, I've lived with questions I never asked and answers I never gave. Some of you are told your loved ones were killed in an ambush, that they died quickly, that nothing more could be known. That wasn't true. The truth is, one man survived that night. He didn't come home. He didn't run to safety. He stayed behind, buried beneath sand and guilt for 20 years. I found him this fall. His name was Boone Miller. He was my best friend. Boone wrote down what happened, not to clear his name, not to hide, but because he believed that the truth, no matter how late, mattered more than silence. He admitted he froze that night, that he returned too late, that he found your loved ones already gone. And instead of coming back and lying about it, he chose to remain with them. I buried him with honor, with the flag he never got, and with the truth you were never given. I'm not asking for forgiveness. Neither was he. I just wanted you to know that someone remembered, someone cared, and someone finally came back to bring them all home, if not in body, then in truth. Clarence signed his name and leaned back in the creaking chair. He let the moment breathe. No one would applaud this letter. It wouldn't make headlines, but it was the most important thing he'd ever written. Over the next few days, he made copies, handwriting each one, sealing them in individual envelopes, and mailing them across the country. Nebraska, Texas, Ohio, Pennsylvania. Families whose lives had been shattered by war, whose questions had echoed into silence. And for the first time, someone was answering. Weeks passed. Most days were quiet. Clarence took to walking again down by the river, or through the veteran cemetery near town. He didn't talk much, didn't explain to people why his eyes had changed, why his shoulders were less tight, why he sometimes stopped walking to stare at the sky like he was looking for someone. But he knew. He'd kept his promise. He'd come back for Boone. And for the rest of them. Then, one afternoon, a letter came. Handwritten. No return. Address. Just a line of neat script. We didn't need to know who was at fault. We just needed to know someone remembered. Clarence read it once, then twice. Then he folded it carefully and placed it inside Boone's notebook. He didn't cry, but something in him exhaled like a pressure valve finally releasing after 20 years of silence. Later that week, Clarence walked into the local cafe for the first time in months. It was just a quiet place on the corner, warm leather booths, the smell of burnt coffee, and old jazz playing faintly in the background. He took his usual seat near the window, ordered a black coffee. No cream, no sugar. As he waited, a younger man across the room glanced up, noticed the silver dog tag still hanging beneath Clarence's shirt. The man wore a similar one. He gave a small nod. Clarence returned it, calm and steady. They didn't speak. They didn't need to, because sometimes the people who've walked through hell can recognize each other, not by their names, but by their silence, by the way they sit, by the way they carry weight no one else sees. Clarence raised his cup slightly in a kind of toast, and the young man gave him a quiet smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough. That night, Clarence pulled out his personal journal, the same one he hadn't touched in years, and wrote a final entry. Boone, I did it. I brought your truth home. I didn't dress it up. I didn't protect you from it. I just passed it along, like you asked. You stayed because of your shame, but you left with your truth. And because of that, I'm starting to live again. Clarence, he closed the journal. Turned off the lamp, and for the first time in a very long time, he slept without dreaming. It was a Thursday morning in late October. The kind of morning that slipped in gently, with soft gray clouds rolling overhead and golden leaves tumbling down like they had nowhere in particular to be. The air smelled like firewood and wet pavement. The streets were still quiet, just a few cars rolling past, and an old dog snoozing on the front porch of the laundromat. Clarence Hayes stood in front of the cafe window for a moment before walking in. It was a small place. No neon signs, no baristas with headsets, no playlists curated by algorithms. Just a chipped bell over the door, a faded open sign, and the warm scent of coffee, buttered toast, and something that smelled like burnt cinnamon. The same cafe he used to go to every morning before the letter came, before the desert called him back. Back then, he would sit in the far corner booth, facing the door, always with his back to the wall, a habit from years of scanning rooftops and alleyways. He never talked much, just nodded at the waitress, ordered black coffee, no sugar, no cream, sometimes eggs. Most days, just the coffee. But today, something felt different. Not in the cafe. That hadn't changed. Same tables, same soft jazz, playing from the ancient speaker behind the counter. Same wobbly stool near the window that the owner still hadn't fixed. What had changed was Clarence. He wasn't sure how to explain it, even to himself. He wasn't any younger. The limp was still there. His bones still creaked when he stood too fast, and his hands still trembled sometimes when he held the mug too long. But the tightness in his chest, that constant, low hum of unspoken weight, was quieter now. Not gone, but not crushing him either. He stepped inside. The bell over the door gave a soft, familiar ding. A couple of heads turned. Not many, just the regulars. He gave a slight nod to Mary at the counter, mid-50s, glasses hanging on a string around her neck. Always knew how to pour coffee without looking. She blinked in surprise when she saw him, then offered a warm, wordless smile, like someone seeing a friend after a long absence. "Clarence," she said simply, sliding a cup onto the counter as if she'd been expecting him all along. He walked over, took the cup in both hands, and felt the warmth seep into his fingers. "Place hasn't changed," he said softly. Mary smirked. "Neither have you," Clarence chuckled. "Lear," she shrugged. "I call it consistency." He didn't answer, just smiled, then turned and made his way to his usual booth by the window. The leather seat let out a familiar groan as he sat down. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, swirling leaves across the sidewalk in tiny golden spirals. People passed, bundled in sweaters, holding warm drinks, eyes locked on their phones or dogs or the day ahead. None of them looked in, but one man did. He was younger, maybe late 20s, early 30s. Military haircut, tight posture, hands worn in a way that told stories no resume could. He wore a tan canvas jacket, jeans, boots, nothing flashy, just efficient. Around his neck, partially tucked beneath his shirt, Clarence saw it, a dog tag. Clarence didn't stare. He didn't need to. The man glanced over. Just a flicker. His eyes met Clarence's just for a second. Then they flicked down to Clarence's own dog tag, which had slipped slightly from beneath his flannel collar. And in that second, the connection was made. A quiet nod from the younger man, a slow, measured nod in return from Clarence. No words. No salute. No, thank you for your service. Just the nod. The one veterans give each other. The one that says, I see you. I know where you've been. And I know what it cost. The man didn't come over, didn't interrupt. He simply turned back to his coffee and sat there, eyes lowered, as if the acknowledgement had been enough, because it had. Clarence sat back, wrapped both hands around his mug, and let the moment settle in. That was the thing no one ever told you about surviving war. It wasn't the nightmares or the triggers that weighed you down the most. It was the quiet. The civilian quiet, where the world kept moving like nothing had happened. Like you hadn't stood inches from death. Like you hadn't buried brothers with your bare hands. Like you were supposed to forget it all and just fit back in. But you didn't fit. You just floated. Until one day someone nodded back and reminded you that you weren't floating alone. Clarence stared out the window, watching a couple of high school kids skateboard past, laughing, their energy uncontainable. He smiled. For a long time, that kind of joy had felt foreign. Like a language he used to speak, but forgot the words too. But no, it didn't seem so far off. He pulled a small object from his pocket. Boone's coin, the same one Boone had once given him after a mission gone wrong. A courage coin. Solid brass, a little nicked, a little worn. Clarence had kept it for years. He'd left a second one at Boone's grave, but this one was going with him wherever he went next. He turned it slowly in his fingers. Then he reached into his other pocket and pulled out the letter, the one he'd received a week ago, from a mother in Nebraska. She'd lost her son in the ambush. All she'd ever known was the official version. Missing in action, presumed dead. No details, no explanations. Just a folded flag and unanswered questions. Clarence had sent her one of the letters, and in return she wrote, "Thank you for not letting him be forgotten. We didn't need someone to blame. We just needed someone who was there, who remembers, who brought something home besides silence." Clarence read those words again, now and again. Something inside him eased. He folded the letter and placed it gently back in his coat pocket. Then he looked up out the window, across the street, toward nothing in particular. And in the reflection, he saw himself. Not the soldier, not the man carrying 20 years of guilt. Just a man who had made a promise, kept it, and returned with a story that needed to be told not with noise, but with honor. And that was enough. Later that afternoon, he returned home. The sun was dipping now, casting long shadows across the porch. He unlocked the front door, stepped inside, and for the first time in a long time, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt peaceful. He walked over to his writing desk, sat down, and opened Boone's notebook one more time. Not to read it. Just to hold it. To remember that truth is its own kind of gravestone, its own kind of freedom. Then he took out his own journal and began writing not for the past, but for the future. I once thought survival meant forgetting, but I was wrong. Survival is remembering and choosing to speak, even when it hurts. Especially when it hurts. Some people die in silence. Others live their whole lives trying to break it. Boone stayed with the truth. And I brought it home. That's enough for me. Clarence closed the journal. Outside, the stars began to appear one by one, like quiet applause from the sky that had seen too much and still kept showing up every night. He leaned back in his chair, breathed in Dot, and for the first time since the war, he wasn't waiting for something to arrive or something to be undone. He was simply home. Title: If I'm the last one who remembers you, then you're still here. Clarence Hayes lived quietly in the months that followed his return from the desert. He didn't travel, didn't suddenly join any veterans groups, didn't take up hiking or photography or some grand late-in-life reinvention. That wasn't his way. Instead, he lived as he always had: early mornings, long walks, black coffee, simple meals. But something had changed. The heaviness that once clung to his every step was no longer there. He moved with a kind of lightness that only comes after you finally set something down after carrying it far too long. People in town noticed Dot, not in the dramatic sense. He wasn't the type to draw attention. But the waitress at the cafe said. He smiled more. The neighbor's kid said he waved back for the first time in years. And once, at the post office, Clarence had helped an elderly woman carry her packages and even stayed to chat about the weather. Small things. But when a man's been silent for decades, small things are seismic shifts. He began to write more. Not stories. Not war memoirs or confessions. Just letters to families of the men who'd served with him. To the mother in Nebraska who wrote him back. To a young veteran he'd met in the cafe who sat alone most mornings, the weight of something invisible on his shoulders. Clarence never offered advice. He just shared pieces of truth. Not sermons. Not speeches. Just one man's journey from silence to honesty. Sometimes, honesty is all people need. Then, one day quietly, without fanfare, Clarence didn't wake up. It was a winter morning. Snow had dusted the ground overnight. The house was still untouched. No signs of struggle. No signs of pain. Just a man in his favorite flannel shirt, slumped peacefully in a reading chair by the window, a blanket across his knees, and a steaming mug of coffee long gone cold on the table beside him. The radio had been left on low. Jazz. The kind Boone used to make fun of. It was the mailman who found him. Clarence had left the front door unlocked, as he often did. The mailman, a quiet kid named Devin, noticed the newspapers had been stacking up. He knocked. Called out. No answer. He stepped inside and found the room filled with morning light. Clarence looked like he had simply fallen asleep, head slightly tilted to the side, the corners of his mouth relaxed, not smiling. Exactly, but no longer carrying the look of a man waiting for something. Devin called the police. They came. So did the coroner. No family nearby. Just a daughter in Texas, who was contacted and scheduled to fly in. But it wasn't the authorities or his family who understood what had really happened. It was the notebook on Clarence's desk neatly. Centered beneath an old brass lamp was his personal journal. The last page was open. His handwriting, always careful, filled every line. Final entry. Boone, you once said you hoped someone would remember. That if I was the last one who did, maybe you wouldn't be gone completely. Well, here I am. The last one maybe? But I remember. Every damn detail. The way you laughed. The way you covered for me when I forgot to radio in. The way you saved my life 3 different times and never mentioned it afterward. You were brave, Boone. Not because you stayed in that cave, but because you told the truth when it would have been easier to lie. I brought that truth home. I passed it on, quietly, without glory. But it's out there now, in the hands of people who deserved it. That was your real mission. And I was just the last pair of boots to walk it. Thank you for waiting on me. You can rest now. And so can I. Clarence. Next to the journal was a photograph. Worn, dog-eared, but preserved with care. It showed 8 men in dusty uniforms, leaning against a Humvee, grinning through exhaustion. Boone was in the center. Clarence was beside him, squinting in the sun, arms crossed like a man trying to look tougher than he felt. They all looked alive, not just in body, but in spirit. That photo would eventually be placed in a frame at the local Veterans Memorial, but not before someone noticed what else was on Clarence's desk. A small, handwritten card propped up against the lamp. Just 12 words, in his familiar all-capitals handwriting. Truth doesn't need applause. IT just needs to be told once. Clarence's funeral was simple. No big ceremony. No headlines. Just a few neighbors, a flag, and a folded copy of his last letter to Boone. A young veteran, the man from the cafe, was among the attendees. He didn't know Clarence well, but he stood stiff, hat in hand, and when the time came to speak, he only said, "Some men die loud." Clarence Hayes died finished. And that was all, because that was enough. After the service, the cafe added something new to its wall. A black and white photo of Clarence, sipping coffee by the window. Below it, a plaque, Clarence Hayes, U.S. Army, retired. He carried truth home, and set IT down, so others wouldn't have to. Months later, his daughter cleaned out the house. She found the letters, the journals, the notebook Boone had left behind. She read them all. One night, she sat on the porch with a cup of tea and whispered into the wind, "You are more than I ever realized, Dad." She donated the letters to a local archive, where they were preserved under the heading, The Boone Miller Collection, Stories of Honor and Remembrance. They weren't war stories. They were truth stories, the kind that don't get told in movies. The kind that unfold in real time, with silence, sweat, guilt, and eventually peace. Years passed, and sometimes, just sometimes, a veteran would wander into that little town, hear the story of Clarence Hayes, and sit quietly in his old booth. By the window, they'd drink black coffee, and they'd nod toward the photo on the wall, not because they knew him, but because they knew someone like him, someone who had stayed, someone who had remembered, someone who had spoken the truth, even when no one asked. And in doing so, reminded them. They weren't forgotten either. Asterisk, some truths are never welcomed. Some don't fit in headlines. And some, like Boone's, wait 20 years beneath the sand for just one soul brave enough to carry them home. Clarence didn't come back as a hero. He came back honest. And maybe that's the only kind of hero this world really needs. Thank you for joining us in this story. If it touched you, share it. If it made you think, speak about it. And if you haven't yet, subscribe. Not for us, but for every story still waiting to be told.